The rifle felt heavier today. Margaret Winters ran the cloth along the barrel one more time, her fingers tracing the worn wood of the stock with familiar precision. 5 years hadn't dulled the sheen of the metal, nor had it dulled the pain that lived in her chest. She kept Thomas's Winchester 73 as pristine as the day he'd last held it, as if preserving the weapon might somehow preserve a piece of him too. Outside, the Nebraska wind howled across the plains, a mournful sound that matched the emptiness within her. Dust particles danced in the shafts of late afternoon light that cut through the cabin's small windows. They were the only things that moved freely in this tomb of a home. Margaret placed the rifle across her lap and reached for the paper and pencil she'd set on the table. The date at the top of the page seemed to mock her, April 17th, 1878, 5 years to the day since the fever had taken Thomas and their unborn child. Her hand barely trembled as she wrote, "My dearest Thomas, I'm coming to you today. I've tried to live in this world without you, but it's a half-life, a shadow existence. The land yields nothing but dust and memory. I'm tired of waking to silence, of speaking to ghosts. Forgive me for what I'm about to do for you both. Or perhaps thank me, for soon we'll be together again, you and I, and the child we never met. Until moments from now, your Margaret." She folded the letter carefully, precisely, and placed it beside the photograph of Thomas in his Union Army uniform. His eyes, deep blue and kind, even in the serious pose demanded by the photographer, seemed to watch her as she picked up the rifle again. Margaret checked that it was loaded, though she knew it was. She'd loaded it this morning with hands that had once been steady enough to stitch wounds under cannon fire. She pressed the cold metal beneath her chin and closed her eyes. The sharp knock at the door startled her so badly that she nearly pulled the trigger by accident. "Mrs. Winters, you in there?" Sheriff Hayes. Margaret lowered the rifle with a shuddering breath and quickly slid it under the table. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and straightened her simple black dress before opening the door. The sheriff stood on her porch, hat in hand, looking uncomfortable as he always did when visiting her homestead. A tall man with a heavy mustache and kind eyes that reminded her of someone she couldn't quite place. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "Afternoon, Mrs. Winters," he said, nodding respectfully. "Sheriff," she replied, her voice rough from disuse. How long had it been since she'd spoken aloud to another person? Weeks, perhaps. "I thought you should know there's an auction in town today. Foster's Mill Properties. And why would that interest me?" Her tone was flat, disinterested. Hayes looked even more uncomfortable. "Well, I know you sometimes attend these things." And he trailed off, unable or unwilling to articulate why he thought she frequented such events. He wasn't wrong. Margaret often went to auctions and foreclosures, not to purchase, but to witness, to see other lives dismantled piece by piece, as if watching others' losses might somehow validate her own. It was a bitter communion with grief that she couldn't explain to anyone, least of all this kind but simple lawman. "Foster died owing a lot of people," Hayes continued. "Everything's going under the hammer, even as well as workers." Margaret's attention sharpened at this. Workers, 3 women, sisters, they were indentured to him. Hayes looked down at his boots. "They're all in a family way." The words landed like stones in still water. 3 pregnant women being sold like cattle. For a moment, Margaret felt something pierced through the protective numbness she'd cultivated for 5 years. Something hot and sharp that might have been anger or purpose. "The auction starts in an hour," Hayes said, replacing his hat. "Just thought you might want to know." After he left, Margaret stood motionless in the doorway, the suicide note on the table behind her momentarily forgotten. She turned and looked at the rifle, then at Thomas's photograph. His eyes seemed different now, not just watching, but waiting. The auction was held in the dusty yard behind what had once been Foster's Mill. A crowd of men gathered in the relentless sun, their faces shining with sweat, their expressions ranging from boredom to predatory interest. The auctioneer, a wiry man with yellow teeth, stood on a makeshift platform, calling out items and accepting bids in a voice that grated on Margaret's nerves. She stood at the back, a black silhouette against the weathered fence. No one approached her or acknowledged her presence. The widow Winters was a ghost among the living, a curiosity best left undisturbed. The mill equipment went first, then Foster's wagon and horses. Each item represented another piece of a life dismantled. Margaret watched with detached interest until the auctioneer called for the next lot. And now Gentleman Foster's final assets. 3 women were led onto the platform. They stood close together, hands bound loosely before them with coarse rope. The eldest, perhaps in her mid-20s, held her chin high despite the fear evident in her rigid posture. The middle sister kept her eyes downcast, her shoulders hunched as if trying to make herself smaller. The youngest couldn't have been more than 19, her delicate features tight with terror, one hand protectively cradling her swollen belly. The foster workers, the auctioneer announced. Sarah, Ruth, and Abigail, all 3 carrying, as you can see. He gestured dismissively at their rounded abdomens. Liabilities, some might say, but others might see opportunity. Their indenture papers have 4 years remaining. A murmur ran through the crowd. Margaret felt her heart rate quicken. The eldest sister, Sarah, scanned the crowd with defiant eyes that suddenly startlingly locked with Margaret's own. Something in those eyes struck Margaret like a physical blow. They were a deep, vivid blue Thomas's eyes. "Who'll start the bidding at $10, the auctioneer called. Silence answered him. The men looked away, shuffling their feet. No one wanted 3 pregnant women, 3 extra mouths to feed that would soon become 6. Then a voice cut through the uncomfortable quiet. $10 Colonel Victor Blackwood stepped forward, his tall frame impeccably dressed, despite the frontier setting. The former Confederate officer had established himself a powerful man in the region after the war, owning the bank and half the businesses in town. His silver hair and beard gave him a distinguished appearance that belied the coldness in his eyes. The sisters stiffened visibly at his bid. Margaret saw fear flash across their faces, not the generalized fear of uncertainty, but the specific terror of recognition. They knew Blackwood, and they feared him. $10 from Colonel Blackwood. The auctioneer announced, relief evident in his voice. "Do I hear 15D?" The silence returned thicker this time. No one would bid against Blackwood. His influence in the town was too great. His retribution too certain. Margaret found herself moving forward before she'd made a conscious decision to do so. $50, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. Every head turned toward her. Whispers rippled through the crowd as men shifted to get a better look at the widow who had broken her long silence. Blackwood turned slowly, his expression shifting from surprise to something harder as he recognized her. "Mrs. Winters," he said, his deep South accent still pronounced after all these years. What possible use could you have for these women? Margaret didn't answer him. She kept her eyes on the auctioneer. $50, she repeated. Blackwood's face darkened. $75, he countered. $100, Margaret responded immediately. The crowd's whispers grew louder. This was far more than 3 indentured pregnant women were worth in practical terms. Blackwood's eyes narrowed as he studied Margaret, clearly trying to discern her motivation. $150, he said, a challenge in his voice. Margaret met his gaze steadily. $200, it was everything she had, the entirety of her savings from 5 years of barely subsisting on her small farm. For a moment she thought Blackwood would continue bidding out of pure spite, but after a tense silence he gave a dismissive wave of his hand. "Let the widow have them," he said, his voice carrying a promise of future reckoning. "They'll be her ruin." The auctioneer, clearly eager to conclude this unexpected confrontation, brought his gavel down quickly. "Sold to Mrs. Winters for $200. Margaret approached the platform, aware of every eye following her movements. She paid the auctioneer from a small leather pouch, the coins heavy in her palm. Then she turned to the 3 sisters, who watched her with expressions caught between hope and dread. She pulled a small knife from her pocket, the one she used for mending harnesses, and cut through the ropes binding their wrists. She didn't speak. She simply turned and began walking out of the yard, expecting them to follow. As she passed Blackwood, he stepped closer, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "You've made a grave mistake today, Mrs. Winters. Your husband isn't here to protect you anymore." Margaret looked up at him, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I never needed his protection," she said quietly. "I only wanted his company." She continued walking, feeling the sisters fall into step behind her. She could sense Blackwood's eyes boring into her back, could feel the weight of his hatred. But for the first time in 5 years, the crushing weight of her grief felt lighter, replaced by something sharper and more immediate. As they left the town behind, Margaret stole a glance at Sarah, the eldest sister. Those blue eyes, Thomas's eyes, watched her warily. How was such a thing possible? It had to be a coincidence, a trick of grief and memory. Yet the sight of them had pulled her back from the brink of death as surely as a hand catching her at the edge of a cliff. The journey to the homestead was silent and arduous. The 4 women walked the dusty road without speaking, the afternoon sun beating down on them mercilessly. Margaret led the way, her pace steady and unhurried. The sisters followed a few steps behind, occasionally whispering among themselves. As they crested the final hill, Margaret's small farm came into view. It wasn't much, a sturdy log cabin, a weathered barn, a corral, and a small vegetable garden that yielded barely enough to sustain 1 person. Everything was meticulously maintained, but lifeless, a monument to routine without purpose. "This is it," Margaret said, her voice startling in the silence. "This is where you'll live and work until your indenture is complete." The 3 sisters looked at the homestead with expressions that mingled relief and apprehension. "Thank you, ma'am," Sarah said, her voice stronger than her exhausted appearance suggested. "We're grateful for—" "I didn't buy you out of charity," Margaret interrupted. "I need help with the farm. You'll earn your keep." She led them inside the cabin. It was a single room with a stone hearth, a sturdy table with 4 chairs, a bed in one corner, and a curtained-off area that presumably served as storage. "You'll sleep there," Margaret said, pointing to the curtain space. "There are blankets. You can arrange it as do you need to." She indicated the hearth and the small pantry beside it. "Food is there. Don't waste it. Water comes from the well outside. The privy is behind the barn." Her instructions were clipped and practical. "I'm devoid of warmth." "Questions?" The sisters exchanged glances. Ruth, the middle one, spoke hesitantly. "What work will we be doing, ma'am?" "Whatever needs doing," Margaret replied. "The garden needs tending. The cabin needs cleaning. The barn needs repair." "We can cook," Abigail, the youngest, offered quietly. And so Margaret nodded curtly. "Good, you'll need those skills." She turned away from them and began removing items from the pantry to prepare a simple meal. "Rest today. Work begins tomorrow." The sisters retreated to the curtained area, their whispers barely audible as they settled into their new space. Margaret worked mechanically, trying to ignore the strange intrusion of life into her carefully maintained solitude. For 5 years she had lived alone with her grief, her daily routines as rigid and unchanging as the seasons. Now there were other heartbeats under her roof, other breaths disturbing the silence. As she prepared the evening meal, her eyes kept returning to the rifle propped in the corner, the rifle that would have ended her life if Hayes hadn't knocked on her door. The suicide note still lay on the table, folded and hidden beneath a book. She would need to burn it later. She set out 4 plates for the first time since Thomas died. The simple act felt sacrilegious somehow, as if she were betraying the sanctity of her grief. When she called the sisters to eat, they emerged cautiously from behind the curtain. They sat together on one side of the table, leaving Margaret alone on the other. No one spoke as they ate the simple meal of beans and cornbread. The sisters ate hungrily but neatly, their manners suggesting they had known better circumstances before their indenture. As Sarah reached for the water pitcher, her sleeve pulled back slightly, revealing a faded bruise on her wrist. Margaret noticed, but said nothing. Foster had clearly not been a gentle master. She wondered what other marks they carried, visible and invisible. After the meal, as the sisters cleaned up, Margaret sat on the porch with Thomas's journal. She often read his entries in the evenings, a ritual of remembrance. Tonight she found herself unable to focus on the familiar words. Her mind kept returning to Sarah's eyes, that impossible blue, and to the moment at the auction when she had outbid Blackwood. The Colonel's hostility had been palpable. Thomas had spoken of him occasionally during the war, always with a mixture of respect for his tactical skill and disgust for his cruelty. Their paths had crossed several times during the conflict, and Thomas had once testified against Blackwood in a military inquiry about the treatment of prisoners. Margaret had never told anyone in town about this connection. Nebraska was full of former soldiers from both sides trying to build new lives far from the battlefields of the East. The war was a closed book that no one wished to reopen, but Blackwood clearly remembered, and now she had publicly defied him. The sound of soft singing drew Margaret from her thoughts. One of the sisters, Abigail, she thought was humming a gentle melody as they finished their chores. The simple tune floated through the cabin, achingly sweet in its normalcy. Margaret closed the journal and went inside. The singing stopped abruptly as she entered. The sisters looked at her apprehensively as if expecting a rebuke. "I'll be up at dawn," Margaret said, ignoring the sudden silence. "I expect you to be ready to work then." They nodded their understanding, and she retreated to her bed in the corner of the cabin. She lay awake long after the sisters had settled behind their curtain, listening to the rhythm of their breathing in the darkness. Their presence felt like an invasion, disturbing the carefully preserved memorial she had made of her life. Yet as sleep finally began to claim her, Margaret realized that for the first time in 5 years she was looking forward to the morning. Dawn broke in streaks of gold and pink across the endless Nebraska skyline. Margaret was already up building a fire in the hearth when the sisters emerged from behind the curtain. They looked rested but wary, uncertain of what the day would bring. Margaret nodded toward the pantry. "Make breakfast," she instructed. "Then we'll see what you can do." She went outside to feed the few chickens she kept and to check on her horse, leaving the sisters to manage the morning meal. When she returned, she found the table set and a pot of porridge bubbling on the hearth. Sarah was kneading dough for bread, her movements practiced and efficient. They ate in the same silence as the night before, but this time Margaret observed the sisters more carefully. Sarah, the eldest, had an air of quiet authority. She was tall and straight-backed despite her pregnancy, with strong hands and watchful eyes. Ruth, the middle sister, was more delicate in build, her movements hesitant, her gaze often downcast. There was a bruise fading on her cheek that matched the one on Sarah's wrist. Abigail, the youngest, had a softer quality to her, but Margaret noticed how she studied the herbs hanging from the ceiling beams with keen interest. After breakfast, Margaret assigned them tasks. Sarah would help repair the chicken coop. Ruth would wash the accumulated laundry. Abigail would weed the struggling vegetable garden. "Can you use tools?" Margaret asked Sarah as they walked to the chicken coop. "Yes, ma'am," Sarah replied. "Our father was a carpenter before." She trailed off. Before what? Sarah hesitated. Before the war changed everything. Margaret handed her a hammer. "The west wall needs reinforcing. The coyotes nearly got in last month." They worked side by side in silence, the rhythmic sound of their hammers filling the morning air. Sarah was indeed skilled with tools, her movements sure and practiced. Occasionally, Margaret caught her wincing and placing a hand on her swollen belly, but she never complained. "How far along are you?" Margaret asked finally. 7 months, I think," Sarah replied. "Ruth is about 6, Abigail 5. Margaret nodded, not asking the obvious questions about the fathers. That wasn't her business. "You should rest when you need to," she said, her voice still matter-of-fact. "I need workers, not martyrs." Sarah gave her a searching look. "Why did you buy us, Mrs. Winters, really?" Margaret drove another nail into the wood with more force than necessary. "I told you I need help with the farm. You outbid Colonel Blackwood." Sarah pressed. "That seems like more than just needing farmhands." Margaret put down her hammer and turned to face Sarah fully. "I know what men like Blackwood do to women like you," she said bluntly. "I was a nurse during the war. I've seen what happens to vulnerable people when predators have power." Sarah's blue eyes, those unsettlingly familiar eyes, widened slightly. "You were a nurse in the Union Army." "Yes, that's how I met my husband." Margaret picked up her hammer again, signaling the end of the conversation. "The coop won't fix itself." They resumed working, but Margaret could feel Sarah's gaze on her, periodically assessing and curious. It made her uncomfortable, as if the younger woman could somehow see past the barriers she had so carefully constructed around her heart. By midday, the homestead had taken on a different rhythm. Ruth had hung washing on the line the first time clothes had danced in the Nebraska wind at the Winters farm in years. Abigail had cleared half the garden of weeds and was carefully examining the struggling plants. The sound of women's voices, quiet conversations, occasional instructions broke the silence that had defined the place for so long. Margaret retreated to the barn to check her supplies, needing a moment away from the strange transformation of her home. The familiar scent of hay and leather surrounded her as she counted sacks of grain and checked the condition of her tools. This was her routine, her control, the ordered existence she had created from the chaos of loss. Mrs. Winters. Margaret turned to find Ruth standing hesitantly in the barn doorway, a basket of folded laundry in her arms. "Where should I put these?" Ruth asked, her voice soft and uncertain. "On the shelf by the hearth," Margaret replied. Ruth didn't move. She seemed to be gathering courage to speak further. "I wanted to thank you," she said finally, "for taking us in, for not separating us." Margaret nodded, uncomfortable with gratitude. "You're welcome, Colonel Blackwood." Ruth began, then stopped, her face paling slightly. "What about him?" Margaret prompted. Ruth shook her head. "Nothing. I should finish the laundry." She turned to go, but Margaret called after her. "Ruth, what do you know about Blackwood?" Ruth turned back slowly. He owns businesses in town, bad places. Before Mr. Foster bought our indenture, I worked in one of them." Her voice dropped to nearly a whisper. "The places where women don't last long." Margaret felt a cold anger settle in her chest. "I see," she gestured to Ruth's bruised cheek. "Did Foster do that to you?" Ruth's hand went automatically to her face. "No, Mr. Foster he wasn't kind, but he wasn't cruel either." This was from before. Margaret nodded her understanding. "Go put away the laundry, then rest. You're carrying a child. You shouldn't overexert yourself." After Ruth left, Margaret remained in the barn, processing this new information. If Ruth had worked in one of Blackwood's establishments, it explained the fear in the sisters' eyes when he had bid on them. It also confirmed Margaret's instinct to intervene had been correct. She hadn't saved them out of compassion. At least that's what she told herself. She had acted on instinct, driven by some combination of her nurse's training and the strange pull she had felt when she saw Sarah's eyes. It wasn't kindness. It was something else, something she wasn't ready to name. Margaret emerged from the barn to find Abigail kneeling in the garden, examining a plant with intense concentration. The youngest sister had removed her bonnet, and her dark hair fell forward, hiding her face. "What are you doing?" Margaret asked. Abigail looked up, startled. "Oh, I'm sorry, Mrs. Winters. I was just looking at your herbs." She pointed to a scraggly plant. "This yarrow is medicinal. My grandmother taught me that it can stop bleeding and fight infection." Margaret stepped closer, intrigued despite herself. "You know herbs." Abigail nodded, a flicker of animation crossing her features. "My grandmother was a healer. She taught me what plants can heal and what plants can harm." She gestured to the garden. "You have some good medicinal herbs here, though they need care." "Show me," Margaret said, surprising herself as much as Abigail. For the next hour, Abigail led Margaret through the garden, pointing out plants and explaining their properties. The young woman's knowledge was impressive, her quiet voice gaining confidence as she spoke of her grandmother's teachings. Feverfew for headaches, comfrey for bones that won't heal, echinacea for fighting illness before it takes hold, Abigail explained. Grandmother said knowing plants is knowing life's secrets. Margaret found herself remembering her own medical training, the frantic battlefield hospitals where herbal remedies often supplemented dwindling medical supplies. "Your grandmother was right," she said. "During the war, herbs sometimes saved more lives than doctors." Abigail smiled for the first time since arriving at the homestead. It transformed her face, revealing dimples in her cheeks. "You really were a nurse," Sarah said. "You mentioned it." "I was for 3 years. That's why you have the medical books," Abigail said, nodding toward the cabin. Margaret frowned. "What medical books?" "On the high shelf behind the flour barrel. I saw them when we were making breakfast." Abigail's smile faded, replaced by worry. I'm sorry, I wasn't snooping. I just... It's all right, Margaret interrupted. You have good eyes. She had indeed kept her medical texts, though she rarely looked at them anymore. They were relics of another life, like Thomas's rifle and journal. By late afternoon, the homestead had been transformed in small but significant ways. The chicken coop was repaired, laundry hung on the line, the garden half weeded and assessed. Inside the cabin had been swept and dusted, the hearth cleaned, and bread was rising near the fire. Margaret stood on the porch, watching the setting sun paint the prairie in shades of gold and crimson. The day's work had been productive, more so than any day in recent memory. The sisters had proven capable and diligent despite their condition. And for the first time in 5 years, Margaret had spent a day thinking of something besides her grief. A movement at the edge of her property caught her attention. A rider approached slowly, his figure silhouetted against the setting sun. As he drew closer, Margaret recognized Sheriff Hayes. She tensed, wondering what brought him to her homestead so soon after the auction. The sisters had retreated inside at the sight of the approaching rider, their instinctive wariness another reminder of their past treatment. Hayes dismounted and removed his hat as he approached the porch. "Evening, Mrs. Winters," he said, his expression troubled. "Sheriff," she acknowledged. "What brings you out here?" Hayes glanced toward the cabin where the sisters' shadows were visible through the window. "Wanted to make sure everything was all right with your new acquisitions." "We're managing," Margaret replied. "Is that all?" Hayes shifted uncomfortably. "There's talk in town about you buying those women, about you crossing Blackwood. People should mind their own business." "Blackwood makes it his business," Hayes said, lowering his voice. "He was asking questions about your land today." Margaret's attention sharpened. "What kind of questions? About your deed, about whether you've kept up with property taxes?" Hayes looked genuinely concerned. He seemed particularly interested in the south section by the creek. "My papers are in order," Margaret said firmly. "Thomas made sure of that before he died." Hayes nodded. "I believe you, but Blackwood has ways of complicating things, especially for women alone." He glanced at the cabin again. "Or women in difficult circumstances." "I can handle Blackwood," Margaret said, though she felt a flicker of unease. Hayes studied her face for a moment. "You know, you remind me of someone," he said unexpectedly. "Can't quite place who, but there's something familiar about you." Margaret stiffened. "Is there anything else?" Sheriff Hayes replaced his hat. "Just be careful, Mrs. Winters. Blackwood doesn't forget a slight, and he's got reason to dislike you beyond today's auction." "What do you mean?" Hayes mounted his horse before answering. "Your husband, Lieutenant Thomas Winters. He testified against Blackwood during the war, didn't he? Something about mistreatment of prisoners." Margaret's surprise must have shown on her face, because Hayes nodded grimly. "Small world, Mrs. Winters. Word gets around even years later. Even out here." As he rode away, Margaret remained on the porch processing this new complication. If Hayes knew about Thomas's testimony against Blackwood, then Blackwood certainly remembered it too. Her bid at the auction hadn't just been a current affront. It had reopened an old wound. She turned and entered the cabin, finding the 3 sisters huddled near the hearth, their faces anxious. "Was that trouble?" Sarah asked directly. "Not yet," Margaret replied, "but it might be coming." She moved to the pantry and reached behind the flour barrel, pulling down the medical texts Abigail had noticed earlier. She hadn't opened them in years, but now she ran her fingers over the worn leather bindings, feeling something stir within her, a memory of purpose, of skill, of a time when she had been more than just a vessel for grief. "Sarah," she said, making a sudden decision. "Tomorrow I'm going to teach you how to shoot." That night, long after the sisters had fallen asleep behind their curtain, Margaret sat at the table with a single candle burning. She opened Thomas's journal to an entry she had read countless times before April 3, 1863. "Witness something today that will haunt me. Colonel Blackwood's regiment captured a dozen Union soldiers last week. Today I saw what remained of them. Not men anymore, just broken things and blue uniforms. Court-martial proceedings begin tomorrow. I will testify to what I saw, though Blackwood's reputation makes this dangerous. Some evils must be confronted even at great cost. I keep thinking of Margaret's safe at the field hospital. What would she say if she knew what I was about to do? She would tell me to speak truth regardless of consequence. Her moral compass is truer than mine. It is one of the countless reasons I love her." Margaret closed the journal and looked toward the curtained corner where the sisters slept. She had acted today without fully understanding why, driven by some instinct she hadn't felt in years. Perhaps it was Sarah's eyes so hauntingly familiar. Perhaps it was the memory of who she had been during the war, not just Thomas's wife, but Nurse Winters, a woman who fought death with every skill at her disposal. Or perhaps it was simply that, faced with the choice between continued emptiness and dangerous purpose, some part of her had chosen life. She opened one of the medical texts and began to read, reacquainting herself with knowledge long dormant. If trouble was coming, she would be prepared not just for herself, but for the 6 lives now under her protection. The suicide note still lay hidden beneath the book. Margaret took it out, read it one last time, and then held it to the candle flame. She watched as the paper blackened and curled, her words of surrender transformed to ash. Outside, the Nebraska wind continued its lonely song across the plains. But inside the cabin, for the first time in 5 years, Margaret Winters was planning for tomorrow. The Winchester kicked against Margaret's shoulder with familiar force. The tin can perched on the fence post 50 yards away danced and clattered to the ground. Again, Margaret said, handing the rifle to Sarah. The morning sun cast long shadows across the east field as Sarah positioned the rifle against her shoulder, mimicking Margaret's stance. Her pregnancy made the posture awkward, but her hands were steady as they gripped the weapon. "Remember to breathe out as you squeeze the trigger," Margaret instructed. "Don't pull, squeeze." Sarah nodded, her blue eyes narrowing in concentration. She took aim, exhaled slowly, and fired. The can on the next post wobbled but remained standing. "Almost," Margaret said. "You're anticipating the recoil. Try again." 3 weeks had passed since the auction. Spring had fully taken hold of the Nebraska plains, painting the previously barren landscape with tentative strokes of green. The homestead had undergone a similar transformation. Laundry fluttered on the line. The garden showed neat rows of tender shoots. Chicken scratch marks dotted the yard. And each morning before the day's work began, Margaret taught Sarah to shoot. Ruth emerged from the cabin carrying a basket of mending. She settled on the porch, her eyes occasionally darting to the shooting lesson with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Of the 3 sisters, she remained the most timid, startling at loud noises and keeping her eyes downcast when Margaret asked direct questions. Sarah fired again. This time the can flew from the post. "Better," Margaret nodded. 5 more rounds, then we start the day's work." As Sarah reloaded, Margaret glanced toward the cabin. Abigail was tending to her newly expanded herb garden, her hands moving with the certainty of someone who knew plants as old friends. In the short time since their arrival, the youngest sister had proven herself not just knowledgeable about herbs, but gifted with them. Under her care, plants that had withered for years now thrived. Margaret had begun working with her in the evenings, comparing Abigail's folk remedies with her own medical training. It was the closest thing to companionship she had experienced since Thomas's death. Sarah fired the remaining rounds, hitting 3 of her 5 targets. She lowered the rifle with a small smile of satisfaction. "You're improving," Margaret acknowledged, taking the weapon back. "Tomorrow we'll try the moving targets." "Do you really think he'll come?" she asked, quietly. "Blackwood." Margaret began cleaning the rifle with practice movements. "I don't know, but it's better to be prepared." She didn't share her deeper concerns with the sisters. Sheriff Hayes had visited twice more in the past weeks, each time with troubling news. Blackwood had been making inquiries about her property deed. Rumor had it he'd hired men to survey the land along the creek that marked her southern boundary. Most worrying there had been strangers in town asking about the Winters woman and her new help. "I could teach Ruth and Abigail too," Sarah suggested. Margaret considered this as she finished cleaning the rifle. "Ruth isn't ready. She's too nervous. She'd be more dangerous to herself than anyone else. But Abigail might learn." She slung the rifle over her shoulder. "For now, 1 shooter is enough. Let's get to work." The day unfolded with the rhythm they had established in the weeks since the sisters' arrival. Sarah repaired fence posts along the eastern perimeter. Ruth did the washing and then helped Margaret smoke meat for storage. Abigail tended her garden and prepared medicines from her herbs. By mid-afternoon, dark clouds had gathered on the horizon, promising a spring storm. Margaret found herself checking the sky periodically as she worked with Ruth to hang the smoked meat in the smokehouse. "We should secure everything before that storm hits," she said. "Tell Sarah to bring in the tools from the east field." Ruth nodded and hurried away. Margaret watched her go, noting how the young woman's gait had changed as her pregnancy advanced. All three sisters were showing more prominently, now their bodies changing with the passing weeks. Margaret found herself increasingly aware of their conditions, mentally calculating dates and preparing for what was to come. She would need to review her midwifery knowledge soon. It had been years since she'd delivered a baby, and even then it had been under the guidance of more experienced nurses. The thought both terrified and energized her. For so long she had lived in stasis, preserving the past rather than building for the future. Now suddenly life was asserting itself into her carefully maintained shrine to grief. A flash of movement at the edge of her property caught her attention. Instinctively, she reached for the rifle that was no longer slung across her back. She had left it in the cabin after the morning's lesson. She squinted against the darkening sky. There, a rider moving along her southern boundary near the creek. Then another. Margaret strode quickly toward the cabin. "Sarah," she called, "get inside." Sarah appeared from the direction of the east field carrying tools. She saw Margaret's expression and immediately understood dropping the tools and hurrying toward the cabin. Ruth emerged from the barn looking confused until Margaret gestured urgently for her to follow. Inside, Abigail was at the table grinding herbs with a mortar and pestle. She looked up in alarm as they entered. "What is it?" she asked. "Riders," Margaret said tersely, moving to where the rifle stood in the corner. She checked that it was loaded. On the south boundary, Sarah moved to the window, peering out cautiously. Blackwood's men, likely. Margaret handed Sarah the rifle. "Stay inside, all of you. I'm going to see what they want." "Mrs. Winters," Ruth began, her voice trembling. "Maybe we should." "Stay inside," Margaret repeated firmly. She took Thomas's revolver from its box on the high shelf and checked its chambers. If they come to the house, Sarah knows what to do. Outside, the wind had picked up, bending the prairie grass and bringing the scent of rain. Margaret tucked the revolver into the pocket of her apron and walked purposefully toward the creek. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her stride was steady. She spotted the riders again, two men on horseback methodically moving along the creek, stopping occasionally to examine the ground or make notes. They wore city clothes rather than the practical attire of farmers or ranchers. Surveyors then, just as Hayes had warned. Margaret approached them directly, refusing to skulk around her own property. The men noticed her when she was about 50 yards away. They exchanged a glance before one nudged his horse forward to meet her. "Afternoon, ma'am," he called, touching the brim of his hat. He was perhaps 40, with a neat beard and spectacles that gave him a scholarly appearance. "Fine piece of land you have here." "You're trespassing," Margaret replied, stopping at a distance that kept both men in her sight. The man smiled apologetically. "We're just doing a bit of surveying, ma'am, public service. This is private property," Margaret said, "and I don't recall requesting any surveying." The second man joined his companion. He was younger, with sharp features and a less conciliatory manner. "We're working for Colonel Blackwood," he said bluntly. "He's interested in purchasing water rights along this creek." "The creek is on my land," Margaret stated, "and I'm not selling." The older man cleared his throat. "There seems to be some question about the exact boundary line, Mrs. Winters," she supplied coldly, "and there's no question I have the deed." "Deeds can be imprecise," the younger man said, "especially older ones. Colonel Blackwood believes the creek may actually mark the boundary rather than being contained within your property." Thunder rumbled in the distance, and the first heavy drops of rain began to fall. Margaret stood her ground, feeling the water soak into her dress and hair. "My deed is clear," she said. "The creek runs through my property, not along its edge, and now I'd like you both to leave." The younger man's expression hardened. We're not finished with our survey. Margaret's hand slipped into her apron pocket, fingers closing around the revolver. Yes, she said quietly. You are. Something in her tone made both men tense. The older surveyor studied her face, then nodded slowly. We'll come back when the weather is better, he said clearly, trying to ease the tension. Perhaps we can speak with your husband then. My husband is dead. Margaret cut him off, and I speak for this property. Do not come back. She stood immobile as they turned their horses and rode away, waiting until they were well beyond her boundary before allowing her shoulders to slump. The rain was falling steadily now, plastering her dress to her body and running in rivulets down her face. When she returned to the cabin soaked and mud-spattered, the sisters were waiting anxiously by the door. Blackwood surveyors, she confirmed as she stepped inside, dripping water onto the wooden floor. They're claiming there's a question about the property line at the creek. Sarah's jaw tightened. He won't stop, will he? No, Margaret said, removing her sodden apron. He won't. Abigail brought her a towel. Her young face creased with worry. Why does he want your land so badly? Margaret dried her hair, considering the question. I don't know. The creek is valuable for water rights, but there are other water sources in the region. There must be something more. Ruth, who had been unusually quiet even for her, spoke up unexpectedly. Gold, she said softly. The other three women turned to look at her. What did you say? Margaret asked. Ruth swallowed visibly. When I worked for him in his establishment, I overheard things. Men talk freely around women they don't respect. Her cheeks flushed with shame, but she continued. Last year there was talk about gold being found in a creek south of town. Blackwood was very interested. He sent men to find the exact location. Margaret sat down heavily at the table. Gold in my creek. I don't know if it's your creek specifically, Ruth said, but it would explain why he wants the land. The implications settled over the room like the gathering storm outside. If there were gold on her property, Blackwood would stop at nothing to acquire it. We need to find out for certain, Margaret said finally. Tomorrow when the storm passes, we'll check the creek ourselves. The rest of the evening passed in tense silence. The storm raged outside, rain lashing against the windows, and thunder shaking the small cabin. Margaret found herself repeatedly checking that the rifle was loaded, and within reach, startling at every sound that might indicate riders approaching through the downpour. The sisters huddled near the hearth, whispering among themselves. Occasionally, Margaret caught fragments of their conversation, concerns about Blackwood, about their futures, about the babies they carried. As the night deepened and the storm began to subside, Margaret made a decision. I need to know more about the three of you, she said abruptly, turning from the window to face the sisters. If we're to face Blackwood together, I need to understand what we're dealing with. The sisters exchanged glances. Sarah, as always, took the lead. What do you want to know? Everything, Margaret said. How you came to be indentured to Foster. What you know about Blackwood, who fathered your children. She paused. And why your eyes look so much like my husband's. Sarah's hand went instinctively to her throat, where a small locket hung on a thin chain, a detail Margaret had noticed but not commented on before now. It's a long story, Sarah said hesitantly. We have all night, Margaret replied, sitting down across from them, and I think it's time for truth between us. Sarah took a deep breath. Our father was Jonathan Miserick, she said quietly. He was a carpenter in Ohio before the war. The name hit Margaret like a physical blow. Jonathan Winters, Thomas's father. That's not possible, she whispered. Thomas never mentioned having sisters. Half-sisters, Sarah clarified, different mothers. Our mother was Jonathan's second wife after Thomas's mother died. Thomas was already grown and gone, by then joining the army before we were born. I don't think he even knew about us. Margaret's mind raced trying to process this revelation. Thomas had rarely spoken of his family, saying only that they had died or scattered during the war. He had been an only child, his mother dead of consumption. When he was young, his father remarried to a woman he barely knew. How did you end up here? She managed to ask. In Nebraska, Sarah's fingers traced the outline of the locket. When father died during the war, our mother tried to keep the family together, but it was hard. She fell ill. Before she died, she gave me this locket with Father's picture inside. She opened it, revealing a small, faded photograph of a man with the same startling blue eyes. She made me promise to keep our family together. After she died, we had nowhere to go. Ruth continued softly. We moved west looking for work. That's when she trailed off, looking down at her hands. That's when Ruth ended up working for Blackwood. Sarah finished for her. I was working as a seamstress in town. Abigail was too young to work, so she stayed with me. When I found out what kind of place Ruth was in, I tried to get her out, but Blackwood wouldn't release her indenture. Then Mr. Foster offered to buy all 3 of our contracts, Abigail added. He needed help at the mill and with his house. He wasn't kind exactly, but he was fair, better than Blackwood. And the fathers of your children? Margaret asked. The sisters fell silent. It was Ruth who finally answered, her voice barely audible over the diminishing rain. Mine is one of Blackwood's men, she said. I didn't have a choice. Abigail reached for her sister's hand. Mine is a boy from town. We were sweet on each other, but when he found out about the baby, he left. Sarah straightened her shoulders. Mine was my intended. He died of fever before we could marry. Margaret absorbed this information, her world tilting on its axis. These women, these girls really were Thomas's family, his half-sisters, which made them. We're family. She said the word strange on her tongue. Thomas was your half-brother. I'm your sister-in-law. Sarah nodded. When I saw you at the auction, I recognized you from the description Thomas had written in his letters to Father. He wrote about his nurse wife with the healing hands and fierce heart. I knew it was you, but I wasn't sure you'd want to acknowledge us. You knew who I was at the auction? Margaret asked, stunned by this revelation. Yes, I admit it. I was hoping you'd see the resemblance, that you'd help us, but I didn't expect you to buy our indenture. I didn't know, Margaret said numbly. I didn't recognize the connection. I only knew that your eyes. She stopped, overwhelmed by the implications. Thomas never knew about you. He would have searched for you if he had. We tried to find him after the war, Abigail said, but we had no address, no way to locate him. Then we heard from a returning soldier that Lieutenant Thomas Winters had settled in Nebraska with his wife. We were trying to save enough to travel here when everything fell apart. Ruth finished. Margaret stood and walked to the shelf where she kept Thomas's few possessions. She took down a wooden box and returned to the table. From it, she removed a packet of letters tied with a faded ribbon. These are from Thomas to me during the war, she said. There's one where he mentions his father remarrying, but he never spoke of siblings. She sifted through the letters until she found the one she sought. Here, she read aloud, Father has remarried a younger woman named Elizabeth. I've not met her, being occupied with this war, but I hope she brings him happiness in his final years. I sometimes regret our estrangement, but the path I've chosen is the right one, even if he cannot see it. Margaret looked up at the sisters. He and his father disagreed about the war. Jonathan didn't want Thomas to fight for the Union. Sarah nodded. Father wasn't political, but he feared losing his only son. After Thomas left, though, Father changed. He began supporting the Union cause quietly. That's how he met our mother. She was organizing supplies for Union soldiers. The revelation settled over Margaret like a heavy blanket. All these years she had thought herself alone in the world. Her only family connection severed with Thomas's death. Now suddenly she had 3 sisters-in-law, soon to be 3 nieces or nephews. Does Blackwood know about this connection? She asked sharply. The sisters exchanged glances again. I don't think so, Sarah said. We never spoke of our family to anyone in town. It wasn't safe to advertise Union connections in some places, even after the war. Margaret nodded, her mind working rapidly. Good, let's keep it that way for now. She looked at each sister in turn. This changes things, but it also makes our situation more dangerous. If Blackwood realizes you're connected to Thomas, it will only strengthen his resolve against us. What will we do? Abigail asked, her hand unconsciously moving to her swollen belly. Margaret's jaw set in a determined line. First, we confirm whether there's gold in that creek. Then we secure our legal position. And we prepare for whatever comes next. She stood feeling more resolute than she had in years. These weren't just 3 random women she had saved on impulse. They were family Thomas's blood. Protecting them wasn't just an act of defiance against Blackwood. It was an obligation to her husband's memory. "Get some rest," she told the sisters. "Tomorrow will be a long day." The morning after the storm dawned clear and bright, the Nebraska sky washed clean of clouds. Margaret rose early, her sleep having been fitful and filled with dreams of Thomas and his unknown sisters. She found Sarah already awake, sitting at the table with Thomas's journal open before her. "I hope you don't mind," Sarah said, looking up as Margaret approached. "I wanted to know my brother better." Margaret should have felt invaded, protective of Thomas's private thoughts. Instead, she felt a strange relief that someone else now carried a piece of his memory. "He would have loved knowing you," she said simply. After a simple breakfast, the 4 women made their way to the creek. The recent rain had swollen it beyond its banks, the water running swift and muddy over rocks and fallen branches. "We need to check where the water runs slowest," Margaret explained, leading them downstream. "If there's gold, it would settle in the bends where the current weakens." They spent the morning running the creek, looking for the telltale glint of yellow among the stones and sand. The work was wet and muddy, their skirts soon sodden and stained. Margaret showed them how to pan for gold, using a shallow tin dish from the kitchen, scooping sediment from the creek bed and swirling it carefully to separate heavier materials. By midday, they had found nothing but ordinary creek pebbles and silt. Margaret was beginning to think Ruth had misheard or misunderstood the conversation she'd reported. "Let's try farther downstream," she suggested, wiping sweat from her brow. The spring sun was surprisingly warm, and all 4 women had removed their bonnets and rolled up their sleeves. They moved to where the creek made a sharp bend before leaving Margaret's property. Here, the water pooled deeper, creating a small, still eddy on the inner curve. Abigail, who had been quietly observant all morning, suddenly spoke up. "Mrs. Winters, look at the plants here." Margaret turned to where the youngest sister was pointing. Along the bank grew a type of rush she hadn't noticed before, with distinctively pointed tips. "What about them?" she asked. "My grandmother called them gold pointers," Abigail explained. "They often grow where there are mineral deposits, the roots like the same conditions that gold does." Margaret examined the plants with new interest. "Show me where they're thickest." Abigail led her to a spot where the rushes grew in abundance. Margaret knelt and began to dig into the bank, with her hands scooping mud and roots aside to reach the soil beneath. Sarah joined her, using a stick to dig deeper. After several minutes of excavation, her stick struck something hard. "Rocks," she said disappointedly. "Let me see," Margaret insisted, reaching into the hole. She pulled out a stone about the size of her palm, caked with mud. She dipped it in the creek, washing away the dirt. As the water cleared the surface, they all gasped. Embedded in the gray rock were distinct veins of yellow, small but unmistakable. "Gold," Ruth whispered, her eyes wide. Margaret turned the rock in her hands, examining it from all angles. "Not much in this piece, but if there's one, there could be more." She looked up at the sisters, her expression grave. "This is why Blackwood wants our land." Sarah's face hardened. "What do we do now?" Margaret pocketed the rock and stood brushing mud from her skirt. "Now we know what we're fighting for, and we make sure our claim is ironclad." As they made their way back to the cabin, Margaret's mind raced with plans and calculations. The gold find wasn't massive, nothing like the great strikes that had drawn thousands to California or Colorado, but even a modest deposit could be valuable. More importantly, it explained Blackwood's sudden interest in property he had ignored for years. "I need to go to town," she announced as they reached the homestead to check on our deed and speak with Hayes. "I'll come with you," Sarah immediately volunteered. Margaret shook her head. "No, you need to stay here with Ruth and Abigail. Keep the rifle close and stay alert." "But we can't leave them unprotected," Margaret said firmly. "And you're the only one who can handle the rifle if needed." Sarah reluctantly agreed. Margaret changed into her one good dress, a navy blue garment she hadn't worn since Thomas's funeral, and hitched her horse to the small wagon. Before leaving, she placed the gold-bearing rock in a leather pouch and tucked it securely in her pocket. "I'll be back before dark." she promised. If anyone comes, fire a warning shot and they'll likely turn back. If they don't, she met Sarah's gaze steadily. Do what you must to protect yourselves. The ride to town took over an hour, the wagon wheels occasionally getting stuck in mud left by the previous night's storm. Margaret used the time to organize her thoughts and rehearse what she would say to Hayes and, if necessary, to Blackwood himself. Kingston was a modest frontier town. One main street lined with wooden buildings, a few side streets with smaller establishments and homes. It had grown in the 5 years since Margaret had first arrived with Thomas, but it was still small enough that a woman traveling alone drew notice. She felt eyes on her as she tied her horse outside the sheriff's office. Women alone were uncommon enough in town. Women dressed in their best and looking purposeful were rarer still. Hayes looked up in surprise when she entered his office. He was alone working on paperwork at his desk, and he stood quickly when he recognized her. "Mrs. Winters," he said, removing his hat though he was indoors. "This is unexpected. I need your help." "Sheriff," Margaret said without preamble. "Blackwood sent surveyors to my property yesterday. They claim there's a question about my boundary at the creek." Hayes's expression grew serious. "I heard they were out that way." "Sit down, Mrs. Winters." He gestured to a chair across from his desk. Margaret remained standing. "I need to see the town's copy of my deed, and I need to know what Blackwood is planning." Hayes studied her face for a moment, then nodded. "The deed copies are kept at the land office next door." "As for Blackwood," he sighed heavily, "he's been asking a lot of questions about your property and about you." "What kind of questions? About how you came to own the land? About your husband's military service?" Hayes looked uncomfortable. "About your current household arrangements." Margaret's jaw tightened. "And what have you told him?" "As little as possible," Hayes assured her. "But Blackwood has ways of getting information. He's friendly with Judge Parker, who oversees land disputes." The implication was clear. If Blackwood challenged her deed, he would have a sympathetic ear in the local judiciary. "There's something else you should know," Hayes added, lowering his voice, though they were alone. "Blackwood's been bringing in men. Rough types. They're staying at the saloon he owns on the edge of town." Margaret absorbed this information, her concern deepening. "Hired guns, most likely. Blackwood was preparing for something. Thank you for the warning," she said. "Now about that deed." Hayes escorted her to the land office next door, where a clerk reluctantly allowed them to examine the town's copy of the winner's deed. Margaret read it carefully, confirming what she already knew. The creek ran through her property, not along its edge. The southern boundary was marked by a line of cottonwood trees nearly a quarter-mile beyond the water. "The deed is clear," she said to Hayes as they left the office. "The creek is well within my property." "Deeds can be challenged," Hayes said grimly, "especially when gold is involved." Margaret stopped in her tracks. "You know about the gold?" Hayes nodded slowly. "There have been rumors, nothing confirmed, but enough to catch Blackwood's interest." "It's more than rumors," Margaret said quietly. "We found evidence this morning." Hayes's eyes widened. "That changes things. If there's proven gold on your land, Blackwood will stop at nothing to get it. Then I need to file a mineral claim, being the one Margaret decided to strengthen my position." "The claims office is at the courthouse," Hayes said. "But Mrs. Winters, I must caution you. Making an official claim will only confirm what Blackwood suspects. It might accelerate his plans." "Better to secure my legal position than hope he gives up," Margaret replied firmly. "Will you come with me to file the claim?" Hayes hesitated, then nodded. "I'll help you, but there's something I need to tell you first." He glanced around the busy street. "Not here. Let's speak in my office." Back in the privacy of the sheriff's office, Hayes seemed uncharacteristically nervous. He paced behind his desk, removing his hat and running a hand through his hair. "Mrs. Winters, Margaret." He began using her first name for the first time. "What I'm about to tell you may come as a shock." Margaret tensed, preparing herself for bad news about Blackwood or the legal status of her land. "My full name is James Hayes Winters," he said quietly. "I'm Thomas's brother." Margaret stared at him, uncomprehending. "That's not possible. Thomas was an only child." Hayes, or Winters, shook his head. "Half-brother, different mothers. My mother was Jonathan Winters' first wife's sister, his sister-in-law. There was an indiscretion after Thomas's mother died." Jonathan married another woman quickly to cover the scandal, but I was born just 7 months after the wedding. Margaret sank into the chair she had earlier refused, her mind reeling from the second familial revelation in less than a day. Thomas never mentioned you, she said weakly. He didn't know about me until we met during the war. I was a private in his unit. Hayes smiled sadly. The resemblance was noticed by others before we realized it ourselves. When we compared stories, we discovered the truth. Why didn't he tell me? Margaret asked, feeling a stab of betrayal that Thomas had kept such a secret. He wanted to after the war, Hayes assured her. He wrote to me about you, often said you were the best person he had ever known, that you'd understand and welcome me as family. But then he died. Margaret finished hollowly. Hayes nodded. I was stationed in Missouri when I got word. By the time I could get away, he was already gone. I didn't know how to approach you in your grief, claiming to be family you'd never heard of. So you became the sheriff here, watching over me from a distance. Margaret wasn't sure whether to feel comforted or manipulated by this revelation. I promised Thomas I'd look out for you if anything happened to him, Hayes said simply. Being sheriff was the best way to do that without intruding on your life. Margaret studied his face with new awareness. Now that she knew to look, she could see traces of Thomas in his features, the shape of his brow, the set of his jaw. Why tell me now? She asked. Because you're in danger, Hayes said gravely. Real danger. And because I've seen a change in you these past weeks. Since those women came to your farm, you have come back to life. Thomas would be glad of that. Margaret took a deep breath, trying to process everything. Those women, the sisters I bought at auction, they're also Thomas's family. His half-sisters from his father's second marriage. Hayes's eyes widened in genuine shock. That can't be coincidence. No, but you... Margaret agreed. It seems Thomas had more family than either of us knew. She stood, feeling suddenly resolute, which gives me even more reason to protect what's ours. What do you intend to do? Hayes asked. First file that mineral claim, Margaret said firmly. Then prepare for whatever Blackwood has planned. She looked Hayes directly in the eyes. Will you help us as family? Hayes straightened, his expression solemn. I've been helping from the shadows for 5 years, Margaret. It's time I did so openly. Together they walked to the courthouse to file Margaret's mineral claim on the gold found in her creek. As she signed the papers, Margaret felt a strange sense of things coming full circle. 5 years ago, she had been half alive, a shell of grief preserving the memory of a dead man. Now she was fighting for a future not just for herself, but for the family Thomas had never known he had. As they left the courthouse, Margaret caught sight of a familiar figure across the street. Colonel Blackwood stood outside his bank, deep in conversation with the 2 surveyors who had visited her property. He looked up as if sensing her gaze, his eyes narrowing when he saw her with Hayes. Margaret didn't look away. She met his stare, directly refusing to show fear. After a moment, it was Blackwood who broke the contact, turning back to his conversation with a dismissive gesture. He knows we're making moves, Hayes said quietly. Good, Margaret replied. Let him know we're not helpless women he can intimidate. As they walked back to her wagon, Margaret felt the weight of the gold-bearing rock in her pocket. It represented both danger and opportunity, a threat to her family's safety, but also a chance for a new beginning. Come out to the farm tonight, she told Hayes. Meet your nieces properly. We need to make plans. Hayes nodded, his expression grave but determined. I'll be there after sundown. Margaret climbed into her wagon, her mind already racing ahead to the confrontation she knew was coming. Blackwood would make his move soon now that she had filed a mineral claim, but he would find that the widow Winters and her newfound family were not the easy targets he imagined. This time Margaret had something worth fighting for, not just land or gold, but the future Thomas would have wanted for them all. As she drove the wagon out of town, Margaret caught a final glimpse of Blackwood watching her departure. She straightened her back and held her head high, channeling the strength she had once shown on blood-soaked battlefields. The war might have ended years ago, but for Margaret Winters, a new battle was just beginning. Twilight settled over the Nebraska plains like a prayer painting, the endless sky in watercolor strokes of indigo and gold. Margaret stood on her porch, watching the horizon where the sun had just disappeared. In the distance, a lone rider approached, silhouetted against the fading light. Hayes. Behind her, the cabin hummed with quiet activity. Sarah moved around the table, setting out plates for supper. Ruth stirred a pot of stew that filled the air with savory aromas. Abigail arranged freshly picked wildflowers in a jar, a small touch of beauty that would have seemed frivolous to Margaret just weeks ago. It was strange how quickly the rhythms of her life had changed, how swiftly solitude had given way to family. For 5 years she had lived in suspended animation, her existence a monument to what she had lost. Now suddenly the homestead breathed with life again. But that life was in danger. "He's coming," Margaret called over her shoulder, not taking her eyes off the approaching rider. Sarah joined her on the porch, Thomas's rifle cradled in her arms. Her pregnancy was now pronounced enough to make the weapon look incongruous against her rounded form, yet she held it with the confidence of someone who had practiced daily. "Just one rider," she asked, her voice tense. "It's Hayes," Margaret assured her. "But stay alert. Blackwood could have men watching." The sisters had taken the news about Hayes with surprising equanimity. Perhaps after discovering they were Thomas's half-sisters, learning about another hidden sibling seemed less shocking. Or perhaps they had simply grown accustomed to life's unpredictable turns. Hayes dismounted as he reached the yard, leading his horse the final few yards. Even in the fading light, Margaret could see the worry etched on his features. "Any trouble on the road?" she asked as he approached. Hayes shook his head. "None that I could see, but that doesn't mean we're not being watched." He removed his hat as he stepped onto the porch. "Evening, Sarah." Sarah nodded in greeting, studying his face with new awareness. "You have his eyes too," she observed. "Different color, but the same shape." A ghost of a smile crossed Hayes's face. "Thomas always said our eyes gave away the connection." He turned to Margaret. "May I come in? We have much to discuss." Inside, Hayes was introduced properly to Ruth and Abigail. The younger sisters were more reserved than Sarah, regarding this newfound uncle with cautious curiosity. But as they sat down to supper, the awkwardness gradually eased. Hayes spoke of Thomas with genuine affection, sharing stories from their time together during the war that Margaret had never heard. "He carried your picture everywhere," Hayes told Margaret. "Showed it to anyone who would look. Said you were the strongest person he'd ever known, that you could stitch a man back together while shells were falling all around." Margaret felt a sharp pang of memory. "He exaggerated. I was just doing my job." "He didn't exaggerate about your courage," Hayes said. "And I think you're going to need it again." His expression turned serious. "Blackwood's making moves faster than I expected. After you left town today, he filed a formal challenge to your property boundary." Margaret's hand tightened around her fork. "On what grounds he claims to have found an earlier survey that places the creek as the boundary line, not the cottonwoods." Hayes shook his head in disgust. "It's fabricated, of course, but Judge Parker has agreed to hear the case." "When shall I?" Sarah asked sharply. 2 weeks from now." Hayes looked grim, but I don't think Blackwood plans to wait for legal proceedings. The men he's brought in aren't the type to respect the law. "How many?" Margaret asked. "At least 6 that I've seen. Hard cases, all of them." The sisters exchanged worried glances. Rue's face had gone pale, her hand unconsciously moving to her belly as if to protect the child within. "What do we do?" Abigail asked, her young voice steady despite the fear evident in her eyes. Margaret considered their options. They could abandon the homestead, flee to another territory where Blackwood couldn't reach them. But that would mean surrendering not just the land and the gold, but everything Thomas had built. Everything he had left for his family, the family he hadn't even known existed. "We stay," she said firmly. "We fight." Against 6 armed men, Ruth questioned, her voice barely above a whisper. 7 counting Blackwood, Hayes corrected grimly. "And 4 of us," Sarah countered, straightening her shoulders. 5 with the sheriff. Hayes shifted uncomfortably. "My position complicates things. As sheriff, I'm sworn to uphold the law, even unjust ones. If Blackwood secures that court ruling, then we need to make our stand before the court date," Margaret concluded. She turned to Hayes. How soon do you think they'll move against us? Soon, perhaps within days. Hayes leaned forward. Blackwood was furious when he learned you'd filed a mineral claim. He knows you found gold. The reality of their situation settled over the table like a shroud. 4 women, 3 of them pregnant, and 1 lawman against Blackwood and his hired guns. The odds were not in their favor, but Margaret had faced terrible odds before on battlefields, where men died by the hundreds, and her hands had been the only thing standing between wounded soldiers and eternity. "We need to prepare," she set her nurse's mind, already cataloging what they would require. "Supplies, ammunition, medical necessities." She looked at each of the sisters in turn. "And we need to make this place defensible." Hayes nodded his agreement. "I can bring supplies tomorrow. Ammunition, extra weapons. But Margaret, you should consider sending the sisters away somewhere safe." "No," Sarah said immediately. "We stay together." Ruth and Abigail nodded their assent, though fear still shadowed their eyes. "We're family," Abigail said simply. "All of us." Margaret felt something warm unfurl in her chest at those words. Family. For so long she had been alone, her only connection to the world severed when Thomas died. Now suddenly she had people to protect, people who were willing to stand with you. "Then we all stay," she decided. "We'll be smart about this. Hayes, what else can you tell us about Blackwood's men?" As Hayes described the hired guns, their habits, their weapons, their apparent experience, Margaret began formulating a plan. By the time the meal ended and the lamps burned low, they had outlined a strategy for defending the homestead. Hayes would return the following day with supplies. They would fortify the cabin and barn, creating defensive positions and escape routes if needed. Sarah would continue practicing with a rifle. Ruth and Abigail would prepare medical supplies and food that could sustain them through a siege. "I should go," Hayes said, finally rising from the table. "If I'm gone too long, it might raise suspicions." Margaret walked him to the door. Outside, the Nebraska night was clear and cold stars scattered across the vast darkness like diamond dust. "Be careful," Margaret warned. "Blackwood may be watching you too now that he's seen us together." Hayes settled his hat on his head. "I can handle myself." He hesitated, then added softly, "Thomas would be proud of you, Margaret, of how you've protected his family." Margaret felt her throat tighten. "I didn't know I was protecting his family when I bought the sisters. You just couldn't stand by and let innocent people suffer." Hayes finished for her. "That's who you are. That's who you are. See, I've always been, even when grief clouded everything else." After Hayes departed, Margaret returned to find the sisters clearing the table, their movements efficient despite their advancing pregnancies. They had adapted to life on the homestead with remarkable resilience, these city girls who had known nothing of farming or frontier life before their arrival. "We should get some rest," Margaret told them. "Tomorrow will be a long day." As she prepared for bed, Margaret found herself opening Thomas's journal again. She turned to an entry she had read countless times, April 10th, 1865. "The war is ending. Word came today of Lee's surrender. The men are celebrating, but I find myself thinking only of home, of Margaret, and the life we will build together. She speaks of Nebraska, of open skies and fresh beginnings. Perhaps that is what we all need after so much death." Hayes agrees he may join us out west once his service concludes. "I look forward to introducing him to Margaret properly, to creating the family connections I've always longed for. I dream of children, of a home filled with laughter instead of screams, of growing old beside the woman who saved me in more ways than she knows." Margaret closed the journal, her fingers lingering on the leather cover. Thomas had wanted family, had dreamed of children. Now, in a twist of fate, too strange to be coincidence, his family had found her, instead had brought life back to the home that had fallen silent with his death. She would not lose them now. Dawn brought a flurry of activity to the homestead. Margaret woke the sisters early, assigning tasks with the efficiency she had once employed in field hospitals. "Sarah, check our ammunition supplies and clean all the weapons. Ruth, we need bandages. Tear any spare cloth into strips. Abigail, gather all your medicinal herbs and prepare as many remedies as possible. Margaret herself inspected the cabin and outbuildings with a tactical eye she hadn't used since the war. The cabin's thick log walls would provide good protection from bullets. The root cellar beneath the floor could serve as a shelter for Ruth and Abigail if fighting broke out. The barn offered additional defensive positions with its hayloft providing an elevated vantage point. By mid-morning, Hayes arrived with a wagon load of supplies, ammunition, extra weapons, food staples, and medical necessities. He brought news as well. None of it good. Blackwood's men were drinking heavily at the saloon last night, he reported as they unloaded the wagon, talking about claiming gold and teaching women their place. I tried to caution them about respecting property rights, but they just laughed. When will they come? Margaret asked, securing a box of ammunition in the cabin. Soon. Today perhaps, or tomorrow. Hayes looked troubled. I can't stay, Margaret. If I'm missing from town when they make their move, Blackwood will know I've warned you. Margaret nodded her understanding. We'll manage. I'll try to delay them, create some distraction in town to buy you time. Hayes handed her a folded paper. This is a telegram I sent to the territorial governor reporting Blackwood's intimidation tactics and the suspicious nature of his claim. It may not help immediately, but it establishes a record. Thank you, Margaret said, tucking the paper into her pocket. Before Hayes departed, he spent an hour with Sarah showing her additional shooting techniques, how to lead a moving target, how to conserve ammunition, how to shoot from cover. He spoke briefly with Ruth and Abigail as well, offering encouragement and practical advice for what might come. When he finally mounted his horse to leave, he turned to Margaret one last time. If things go badly, there's a cavalry outpost 40 miles east. They might respond to reports of armed violence against civilians. Let's hope it doesn't come to that, Margaret replied. The rest of the day passed intense preparation. Margaret found herself falling back on skills honed during the war, assessing resources, preparing for casualties, establishing clear protocols for different scenarios. By evening, they were as ready as they could be. The cabin had been fortified with furniture positioned to provide cover. Buckets of water stood ready to douse fires. Weapons and ammunition were distributed strategically throughout the homestead. As darkness fell, Margaret gathered the sisters in the cabin. Outside, a spring storm was brewing, thunder rumbling in the distance. It reminded her of artillery fire, a sound she had hoped never to associate with home. Try to rest, she told the sisters. Sleep in shifts. 2 awake, 2 asleep. Ruth, who had been quiet most of the day, suddenly spoke up. If they come, if Blackwood comes, she swallowed hard. He won't show mercy. Neither will we. Sarah said firmly, checking Thomas's rifle one more time. Margaret looked at each of them in turn. Sarah with her determined jaw and Thomas's blue eyes. Ruth with her fragile exterior that masked unexpected strength. Abigail with her quiet wisdom beyond her years. In just a few weeks, they had become more than charges under her protection. They had become family. Whatever happens, Margaret said, we face it together. The storm arrived with full force. An hour later, rain lashing against the windows and thunder shaking the cabin's sturdy frame. Margaret took the first watch with Sarah, while Ruth and Abigail tried to sleep behind the curtained area. They sat in silence by the fire, listening to the storm's fury. Margaret found herself remembering another night of thunder years ago when she and Thomas had huddled together in a field hospital as artillery fire rained around them. He had held her hand, then his touch an anchor in the chaos. He would have loved you, Margaret said suddenly, looking at Sarah's profile in the firelight. Thomas, I mean. He always wanted siblings. Sarah smiled faintly. I used to imagine meeting him. In my mind, he was larger than life, the brave Union officer fighting for justice. He was just a man, Margaret said softly. A good man, but human like the rest of us. Afraid sometimes, uncertain, but he always tried to do what was right, even when it cost him. I mean, like testifying against Blackwood, Sarah observed. Margaret nodded. That was Thomas. He couldn't abide cruelty or injustice, no matter the personal risk. They fell silent again, each lost in thoughts of the man who connected them. Outside, the storm began to subside, the thunder growing more distant, the rain softening to a gentle patter. It was in that quieter moment that they heard it, the unmistakable sound of horses approaching. Margaret was on her feet instantly. "Wake Ruth and Abigail," she ordered in a hushed voice, reaching for the revolvers she kept nearby. "Get them to the root cellar." Sarah moved swiftly, rousing her sisters, while Margaret peered cautiously through a window. In the dim moonlight now breaking through the clouds, she could make out several riders approaching from the south, from the direction of the creek. "How many?" Sarah asked, returning to Margaret's side with the rifle. "At least 4, maybe more," Margaret replied. "They're trying to stay hidden, using the trees as cover." Ruth and Abigail emerged from behind the curtain, their faces pale with fear, but composed. "Get to the root cellar," Margaret instructed them. "Take water bandages and a weapon. Stay quiet no matter what you hear." Ruth hesitated. "What about you and Sarah?" "We'll handle this," Margaret said with more confidence than she felt. "Go now, quickly." As the younger sisters disappeared through the trap door to the root cellar beneath the cabin floor, Margaret turned to Sarah. "Remember what Hayes taught you. Don't fire unless you have a clear shot. Make every bullet count." Sarah nodded grimly, taking up position at one window while Margaret covered another. They dimmed the lamps, leaving only the faint glow of the dying fire to illuminate the cabin's interior. Outside, the riders had stopped at the edge of the clearing. Margaret counted 6 men, their figures occasionally illuminated by the fitful moonlight breaking through the departing storm clouds. They appeared to be conferring, gesturing toward the cabin and the barn. "Blackwood isn't with them," Sarah whispered. "He wouldn't dirty his hands directly," Margaret replied. "These are his hired guns." One of the men separated from the group, approaching the cabin with exaggerated caution. When he was about 30 yards away, he called out, his voice carrying clearly in the post-storm stillness. "Hello, the house. Anyone awake in there?" Margaret and Sarah remained silent, watching. "We know you're in there, Mrs. Winters," the man continued. "We just want to talk about that creek property. Colonel Blackwood sent us with a generous offer." Still, they did not respond. The man turned back toward his companions, shrugging. At some signal, Margaret couldn't see the men suddenly spread out too, heading toward the barn, while the others approached the cabin from different directions. "They're surrounding us," Sarah said tensely. Margaret made a swift decision. Fire a warning shot over their heads. Sarah raised the rifle, took careful aim through the window, and squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked through the night air, causing the approaching men to dive for cover. "That's your only warning," Margaret called out. "This is private property. Leave now." There was a moment of silence, then a burst of mocking laughter from the darkness. 2 women against 6 men. A different voice called back. "Bad odds, ladies. We're taking that Gold Creek one way or another. Makes it easier for everyone if you just sign the papers. There are no papers that will make me sign away what's mine." Margaret responded. "Leave now or face the consequences." The only answer was a shot that splintered the window frame inches from her head. Margaret ducked as glass shattered inward, then returned fire with her revolver, aiming at a muzzle flash she'd spotted near the woodpile. A cry of pain told her she'd hit something or someone. The night erupted into chaos. Shots came from multiple directions, bullets thudding into the cabin's log walls or whistling through windows. Margaret and Sarah returned fire, methodically moving from window to window to give the impression of more defenders. "They're trying to reach the porch," Sarah warned, firing at a shadow that darted between trees. Margaret saw another figure making a run for the barn. She fired twice, missing with the first shot, but hitting him with the second. The man stumbled but kept going, disappearing into the barn's shadowed interior. "They'll try to set fire to the cabin," Margaret predicted, reloading her revolver with practice movements. "We need to keep them away from the walls." For what seemed like hours, but was probably only minutes, they maintained their defense, firing only when they had clear targets, making each shot count as Hayes had instructed. 2 of the attackers were definitely wounded. Margaret had heard their cries and seen one being dragged to cover by his companions. But the remaining men were adapting, using the outbuildings and trees for cover as they worked their way closer to the cabin. And Margaret knew their ammunition wouldn't last forever. A new sound caught her attention, breaking glass followed by the unmistakable whoosh of flames igniting. Through the window, she saw fire blooming along the side of the barn. "They're burning us out." Sarah gasped, her face illuminated by the growing blaze. Margaret calculated quickly. The barn was far enough from the cabin that the fire wouldn't spread immediately, but it created a new problem. The light from the flames would expose anyone trying to move between buildings, eliminating the cover of darkness they had relied on. "We need to," she began, but was interrupted by a sound from the back of the cabin, the scrape of a boot on the porch steps. Margaret whirled, raising her revolver just as the back door splintered inward. A large man burst through, gun drawn. Sarah fired without hesitation, the rifle's report deafening in the confined space. The intruder staggered but didn't fall, returning fire as he lunged forward. Margaret felt a searing pain across her upper arm as a bullet grazed her, but she maintained her aim and fired twice. The man finally collapsed, his weapon clattering to the floor. "Behind you!" Sarah shouted. Margaret turned to see another attacker at the front window taking aim at Sarah. She fired her last 2 bullets in rapid succession. The man jerked backward and disappeared from view. "Are you hit?" Sarah asked, urgently moving to Margaret's side. "Just grazed?" Margaret replied, pressing a hand to her bleeding arm. "How many bullets do you have left?" 3 in the rifle, maybe 10 for the revolver." Sarah looked grim. Not enough. Outside, the barn was fully engulfed. Now flames reaching toward the sky and casting a hellish glow over the homestead. In that light, Margaret could see at least 3 men still active, using the distraction of the fire to work their way closer to the cabin. "We need to get to the root cellar," she decided. "Barricade ourselves in with Ruth and Abigail." As they prepared to retreat, a new sound reached them, horses approaching at a gallop, not from the direction of the attackers, but from the road. Multiple riders moving fast. "Reinforcements," Sarah said despairingly. "They've brought more men." Margaret moved to the window, peering cautiously through the broken glass. In the firelight, she could make out several riders emerging from the darkness, but something about their approach was different. More organized, more disciplined than Blackwood's hired guns. A commanding voice rang out. "This is Sheriff Hayes, drop your weapons." Relief flooded through Margaret. Hayes had come, and he wasn't alone. She counted at least 4 other riders with him, all armed. The night dissolved into confused shouting and sporadic gunfire. 2 of Blackwood's men tried to flee toward the creek, but were cut off by Hayes's deputies. Another surrendered immediately, throwing down his weapon and raising his hands. One man made a desperate dash for the trees, firing wildly as he ran. Multiple shots answered him, and he fell face down in the mud, motionless. In less than 5 minutes, it was over. Hayes and his men had subdued or killed all of Blackwood's hired guns. As silence fell once more over the homestead, broken only by the crackling of the burning barn, Margaret opened the cabin door. Margaret Hayes called, dismounting and rushing toward her. "Are you hurt?" "Just a graze," she replied, indicating her bloodied sleeve. "Sarah's unhurt. Ruth and Abigail are in the root cellar." Hayes looked relieved. "Thank God. When I heard Blackwood's men had ridden out, I gathered every trustworthy man I could find and followed." He glanced at the burning barn. "I'm sorry we couldn't get here sooner." "You came when it mattered," Margaret said simply. As Hayes's men secured the surviving attackers, Sarah helped Ruth and Abigail from the root cellar. The younger sisters were shaken but unharmed, clinging to each other as they emerged into the firelit night. "It's over," Sarah assured them. "We're safe." But Margaret knew better. "Not yet," she said, looking at Hayes. "Blackwood is still out there, and he'll be desperate now." Hayes nodded grimly. "We should get you all to town where I can protect you properly." Margaret was about to agree when a rider appeared at the edge of the property, a solitary figure silhouetted against the night sky. Even at a distance, she recognized the straight-back posture and distinctive hat. Blackwood. He remained motionless for a long moment, surveying the scene, his defeated men, the burning barn, Hayes and his deputies. Then, without a word, he wheeled his horse and galloped away into the darkness. "Let him go," Hayes said, placing a restraining hand on Margaret's arm as she instinctively moved forward. "We'll deal with him properly through the law." Margaret wasn't convinced, but she nodded. The immediate danger had passed, and her arm was beginning to throb painfully where the bullet had grazed it. "Come inside," she said wearily. "All of you. We need to tend wounds and decide what to do next." So yeah, dawn revealed the full extent of the night's violence. The barn was a smoldering ruin. Bullet holes pocked the cabin's exterior. 2 of Blackwood's men lay dead, covered with canvas sheets until they could be properly transported to town. 3 others were wounded but alive under guard by Hayes' deputies. Margaret had treated all the injured, friend and foe alike, her nurse's training overriding any impulse toward vengeance. Her own wound had been cleaned and bandaged by Abigail, whose herbal poultice had eased the burning pain. Hayes had sent one of his men to town with news of the attack and instructions to watch for Blackwood, who had not been seen since his brief appearance the night before. "What happens now?" Sarah asked as they sat around the table, exhaustion evident in every face. "We go to town," Hayes replied. "All of you. It's not safe here, not while Blackwood is free." Margaret knew he was right, but the thought of abandoning the homestead even temporarily filled her with reluctance. This land was all she had left of Thomas, the future he had planned for them. "The hearing about the property boundary is still scheduled for next week," Hayes continued. "With evidence of Blackwood's violent attempt to seize the land plus the gold discovery, I believe the judge will rule in your favor. Even Parker, corrupt as he is, can't ignore such blatant criminal activity." "And if he doesn't?" Abigail asked softly. Hayes's expression hardened. "Then we appeal to the territorial governor. I've already sent telegrams about the situation. They spent the morning salvaging what they could from the damaged homestead. The cabin itself was structurally sound, despite the bullet holes and broken windows. The barn was a total loss, but the chicken coop and smokehouse had survived unscathed. By noon, they were ready to depart. Margaret took one last walk around the property while Hayes and his men prepared the wagons. She found herself drawn to the creek, the source of both their trouble and their potential prosperity. The water flowed clear and cool over smooth stones, giving no indication of the gold that lay hidden in its banks. Margaret knelt and dipped her hand into the current, letting the water slip through her fingers like time itself. "Mrs. Winters?" She turned to find Ruth standing a few yards away, her expression hesitant. "Yes, Ruth, I just wanted to thank you," the young woman said, her voice stronger than it had been when she first arrived at the homestead. "Not just for saving us at the auction, but for teaching us to be strong." Margaret looked at her with surprise. "I didn't teach you that. You were already strong. You just needed to remember it." Ruth shook her head. "Before we came here, I thought I was broken. What happened to me at Blackwood's place, I thought it had destroyed something inside me that couldn't be fixed." She rested a hand on her swollen belly. "But watching you, learning from you, it helped me see that we can survive terrible things and still have a future." Margaret felt unexpected tears prick her eyes. "We all have a future now," she said softly. "Together." When they returned to the cabin, Hayes was helping Sarah and Abigail into the wagon. The wounded prisoners had already been loaded into a second wagon under guard. "Ready?" Hayes asked as Margaret approached. She took one last look at the homestead, at the life she had built with Thomas, at the solitary existence she had maintained after his death, at the unexpected family she had found in his absence. "Yes," she said, "I'm ready." The journey to town passed uneventfully, though Hayes kept his men alert for any sign of Blackwood. They arrived in Kingston by late afternoon, drawing curious stares from townspeople as they made their way to the jail. Hayes had arranged rooms for the women at the small hotel, deeming it safer than his own modest quarters behind the sheriff's office. As they settled in, Margaret found herself thinking of the last time she had stayed in town, the night before she and Thomas had left for their homestead, full of hopes for their future. Now she was back, a different woman with a different family, facing an uncertain tomorrow. The following day brought news Blackwood had been seen boarding the eastbound train, apparently fleeing the territory. Hayes was skeptical. "It's too convenient," he said when he visited them at the hotel. "Blackwood isn't the type to surrender so easily." His suspicion proved correct. That evening, as Margaret sat with the sisters in their hotel room discussing plans for rebuilding the barn, a commotion erupted in the street below. Sarah moved to the window, peering cautiously through the curtains. "It's Blackwood," she reported tensely. "With Judge Parker, several other men. They're going into the sheriff's office." Margaret joined her at the window, watching as the distinguished figures disappeared into the building across the street. He's making his move legally this time. What can he do? Abigail asked worriedly. With Parker's help, issue warrants, make false claims, twist the law to his advantage. Margaret's mind raced. We need to get to Hayes. But before they could act, another sound rose from the street. Hoof beats, many of them approaching rapidly from the east. A column of uniformed cavalry soldiers rode into view, led by an officer whose bearing suggested authority. The cavalry. Ruth breathed. Hayes's telegram worked. They watched as the officer dismounted outside the sheriff's office, followed by several of his men. The rest of the troop remained on horseback, their presence bringing a sudden hush to the previously bustling street. We should go down, Margaret decided. See what's happening. They made their way to the hotel lobby just as Hayes burst through the front door, his expression a mixture of relief and urgency. Margaret, thank God you're here. Come quickly, all of you. What's happening? Sarah demanded as they followed him outside. Captain Reynolds from Fort Kearney, Hayes explained hurriedly. He's responding to my telegram about armed violence against civilians, and he's brought something else, documentation about Blackwood's war crimes. Margaret's heart quickened. Thomas's testimony. Hayes nodded. Apparently it was filed but never acted upon until now. Reynolds served under the same commander as Thomas. When he received my telegram with Blackwood's name, he connected the dots and brought the file. They entered the sheriff's office to find a tense standoff in progress. Captain Reynolds, a stern-faced man in his 40s, stood facing Blackwood and Judge Parker. Several cavalry soldiers flanked their captain, while Blackwood's few remaining supporters clustered nervously to one side. "Ah, Mrs. Winters," Captain Reynolds said as they entered. "Your reputation precedes you. Your husband served honorably under Colonel Harris, as did I." "Thank you, Captain," Margaret replied, acutely aware of Blackwood's glare. "I understand you've brought information about Colonel Blackwood." Indeed, Reynolds tapped a file on Hayes's desk. Documentation of war crimes committed during the conflict, specifically the torture and execution of Union prisoners in 1863. Lieutenant Thomas Winters was a key witness, though the case was apparently set aside after the war. Judge Parker, a florid man with an impressive beard, shifted uncomfortably. "That's all very interesting, Captain, but it has no bearing on the current property dispute between Colonel Blackwood and Mrs. Winters. On the contrary," Hayes interjected, "it establishes a pattern of criminal behavior and a motive for targeting Mrs. Winters, specifically revenge against her husband." Blackwood's composed facade finally cracked. "This is absurd." He spat ancient history being dredged up to distract from the real issue, trespassing and theft of mineral rights. Theft. Margaret stepped forward, facing Blackwood directly. "The creek runs through my property. The gold within it is mined by law." "Your property line is in dispute," Blackwood countered. "A dispute you manufactured," Hayes said firmly. "We have testimony from your hired men that you ordered them to seize the land by force, knowing your legal claim was fraudulent." Captain Reynolds cleared his throat. "Judge Parker, I have orders to investigate reports of armed violence against civilians in this territory. Based on the evidence I've seen, including the sworn statements from Sheriff Hayes and these prisoners, Colonel Blackwood appears to have organized what amounts to an armed insurrection." Parker's face had grown increasingly pale during this exchange. "That's a serious accusation, Captain." "Indeed, it is," Reynolds agreed, "one that would typically be tried in a military court given Blackwood's former rank and the nature of the crimes." This was clearly news to Parker, whose allegiance to Blackwood visibly wavered. Blackwood himself seemed to shrink, his commanding presence diminished by the turning tide. He looked at Margaret with naked hatred. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Yes, Colonel?" she replied steadily. "It is." At a nod from Reynolds, two soldiers stepped forward to take Blackwood into custody. The once powerful man offered no resistance, though his eyes promised retribution until the last moment before he was led away. Judge Parker, suddenly eager to distance himself from his former ally, assured Hayes and Captain Reynolds that he would dismiss any challenges to Margaret's property deed immediately. As the impromptu hearing concluded, Margaret found herself surrounded by her newfound family, Sarah, Ruth, and Abigail on one side, Hayes on the other. Together they had faced down a man who had once commanded fear and respect throughout the region. "It's really over," Abigail said wonderingly as they stepped back into the street. Margaret nodded, though she knew the road ahead would not be easy. The barn needed rebuilding. The gold in the creek would require proper mining. And soon, very soon, 3 new lives would enter the world: Thomas's nieces or nephews' children who would never know him but would grow up hearing stories of his courage. "What now?" Ruth asked unconsciously, echoing Margaret's thoughts. Margaret looked at each of them in turn. These women who had arrived as strangers and become family. This man who had watched over her from afar, honoring a promise to his brother. Now she said, "We go home." Wet. Summer bloomed across the Nebraska plains, painting the once barren landscape in vibrant greens and golds. The new barn stood sturdy and weather-tight, its fresh-cut timber still so fragrant in the warm air. Beside it, the chicken coop had doubled in size, housing a flock that provided eggs enough to sell in town each week. Margaret sat on the porch, shelling peas into a bowl as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the horizon. From inside the cabin came the sound of a baby's cry, quickly soothed by a gentle voice. Ruth appeared in the doorway, a small bundle cradled in her arms. "He's settled now," she said, her face soft with new motherhood, "just wanted to be held." Margaret smiled. "Bring him here, let him feel the breeze." Ruth joined her on the porch, carefully positioning her son, barely 2 weeks old, so the fresh air could caress his tiny face. The infant's eyes, still the unfocused blue of newborns, blinked up at the vast Nebraska sky. "He looks more like you every day," Margaret observed. Ruth beamed with pride. "Sarah says he has the winter's eyes, though the family trait." Inside, Sarah's daughter, born first among the 3 babies just a month earlier, slept peacefully in the cradle Thomas had built for their own child, who never arrived. Abigail's time was near. Her son or daughter would complete the trio of new lives that had transformed the homestead. The sound of an approaching wagon drew their attention. Hayes appeared around the bend in the road, raising his hand and greeting as he neared the cabin. "Uncle James is here," Ruth told her son, though the infant showed no recognition of either the words or the approaching visitor. Hayes had become a regular presence at the homestead in the months since Blackwood's arrest and subsequent conviction. He had supervised the barn raising, bringing men from town to help with the heavy work. He had arranged for a mining expert to assess the gold deposit in the creek, which had proven modest but profitable enough to secure their future. Most importantly, he had become family, the uncle who told stories of Thomas, who helped Sarah improve her shooting, who carved tiny wooden animals for the babies. "Ladies," Hayes called as he climbed down from the wagon. "Beautiful afternoon. Any news from town?" Margaret asked as he joined them on the porch. Hayes nodded. Blackwood's appeal was denied. "He'll serve his full sentence." He tickled the baby's cheek gently. "How's young Thomas doing today?" Ruth had named her son after the half-brother she had never met, a gesture that had brought tears to Margaret's eyes when first announced. "Growing stronger every day," Ruth replied proudly. Hayes produced a letter from his pocket. "This came for you, Margaret, from the governor's office." Margaret set aside her bowl of peas to accept the envelope. Inside was a formal document confirming her mineral rights and granting an additional parcel of land adjacent to her property as compensation for damages suffered during Blackwood's attack. More land, she mused, passing the letter to Ruth. Thomas always wanted to expand. "Speaking of expansion," Hayes said with a smile, "I've been thinking about that plot next to mine in town. It would make a fine location for a proper doctor's office." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "A doctor's office or a nurse's practice," Hayes amended. "Kingston's growing. People need medical care beyond what old Dr. Phillips can provide with his shaky hands and outdated methods." It wasn't the first time Hayes had suggested Margaret return to medical work. Since the babies had begun arriving, she had found herself using her long-dormant skills first, with Sarah's difficult delivery, and then with Ruth's smoother one. The satisfaction of bringing new life into the world had awakened something within her, a sense of purpose she had thought died with Thomas. "I'll consider it," she said, as she had each time before. But this time, she meant it. The homestead was thriving under their collective care. The gold from the creek provided financial security. In the babies, Thomas's legacy, in more ways than one, ensured the Winters name would continue. Perhaps it was time to expand her horizons beyond these acres that had been both prison and sanctuary for so long. As if sensing her thoughts, Sarah emerged from the cabin with her daughter in her arms. Abigail followed, one hand supporting her heavily pregnant belly as she eased herself onto a porch chair. "I heard a wagon," Sarah said, nodding a greeting to Hayes. "Any news about Blackwood?" Hayes repeated the information about the denied appeal to general satisfaction. "Good," Sarah said firmly. "Let him rot." Sarah Abigail admonished gently, though without real conviction. They sat together as the sun continued its descent, casting long shadows across the homestead. The babies dozed in their mother's arms. Hayes recounted town gossip. Margaret found herself observing them all with a sense of wonder. This family that had formed from fragments, this home that had transformed from a shrine to the past into a cradle for the future. 5 years ago, she had been prepared to end her life, convinced that grief was all that remained for her. Now, as evening painted the Nebraska sky in watercolor hues of pink and gold, Margaret Winters looked at the faces of her family and saw not endings but beginnings. Thomas had wanted roots, had dreamed of children running across these plains. In his absence, his dream had taken an unexpected form. Half-sisters he never knew, half-brother who honored his memory, a wife who had found her way back to the living, and babies, 3 small lives who would grow up hearing stories of the brave Union lieutenant who had indirectly brought them all together. It wasn't the future Margaret had planned. It was better, richer, more complex, filled with the kind of love that grows not from obligation but from choice, from facing darkness together and emerging into light. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Margaret looked at her family and finally allowed herself to think the words that had been forming in her heart for months. This is enough. This is everything. And for the first time in years, she believed it.